So again, today we're talking about conversion science and how to use quantitative and qualitative data in your everyday decision making as it pertains to your e-commerce site. Throughout this session, please feel free to tweet using the tags Magento Imagine or Conversion Science, and my Twitter handle is KPE. As Danny mentioned, I'm the founder and CEO of a company called Blue Acorn. I've been in the e-commerce space for probably about almost 15 years, doing a variety of different things. But Blue Acorn is a company I started about 6 years ago, and around the same time that Magento first started coming around as well. So today, Blue Acorn is a Magento Gold Solutions partner. We are also a partner with Google Analytics, as well as an Optimizely certified partner. And essentially, we use these collection of tools to drive results for our clients using data-driven solutions. But we provide design, development, and optimization services with a 70-person plus in-house team all in Charleston, South Carolina. Enough about me. So my goal in this session is to help us all make smarter e-commerce decisions. And what I'm going to ask each of you to do is to, A, be an active participant in this session. I'm going to ask a lot of questions. Raise your hands, participate. This isn't a session where I'm going to want you to fall asleep and doze off while reading your emails the whole time. So please participate and be an active member because you're all part of the solution as well. And ultimately, what I want you to do at the end of this session is to tweet me and let me know if you walk away today feeling smarter about the e-commerce decisions you make or not. I use data quite a bit in everything that I do, and part of the feedback loop for me is to hear from you all about how you felt about this session and if you actually are smarter at the end of this. No small task. All right, so I want to talk a little bit about the current state of design and development and the current state of how we make decisions today. So my first question is, who dropped the glasses? Second question is, how are these decisions made today? How do we make e-commerce decisions today? And before I get to this, I guess it's worth surveying the audience. How many of you here are actually a merchant or someone that sells products online? Great, so most of you. Everybody else get out. So we deal with a lot of companies selling products online every day, and I often am exposed to this decision-making process about how companies make these decisions. And I find a lot of consistency and a lot of patterns. I'm going to generalize a little bit. Not everyone here is going to fall into this category. But ultimately, I see a lot of decisions made based on someone's opinion, something you learned at a conference that you took back and said, oh, we got to do this. The hippo syndrome, which is the highest paid person's opinion, your boss that probably says, I want it to do this. This is oftentimes how we see companies making decisions today about what should be done on their site. And I think experience and intuition and judgment go a long way in making wise decisions. But ultimately, what I see is a dramatic imbalance about how we make decisions. And my goal in becoming smarter about making decisions is to incorporate data into that equation so that we're all smarter about it and at least balancing the scales. Let me ask you, out of everyone who is a merchant here, how many of you would consider yourself data-driven today? So roughly, it seems about half of you. Great. Congratulations. If I had to ask you on a scale of 1 to 5, with 5 being extremely data-driven and 1 being nascent and data-driven, keep your hands up through the whole time and lower them as I go through the scale and let me know where you fall. So how many of you would consider at least a 1 on a scale of 1 to 5? All right, keep your hands up. How many would you consider at least a 2? If you're not a 2, lower your hand. What, a 3? 4? Only a handful. You should probably be up here with me. 5s? Nobody. Good. I don't even consider myself a 5. So we're going to play a little game called Forrester Family Feud. Again, I'm going to need your participation in this. Forrester did a study last year, and it asked online retailers, why did they redesign their site? So, raise your hand if you want to guess at what the top 2 reasons cited were for redesigning the site. Just give me one of them. Thought it was ugly. Oftentimes the case. Improve conversion. Competitor. Hire a new designer. Mobile. All the above, right? All very good reasons, but the top 2 reasons cited in a study, the first goal was to increase conversion. The second goal was to increase average order value, the top 2 reasons cited. In this very same study, they asked the same audience, how has it gone? And I'm going to ask you again, what do you think 2 of the top 3 negatively impacted KPIs were from a redesign? Conversion and average order value, ironically enough. 39% of the time, conversion rate decreased. 25% of the time, average order value decreased. You might look in amazement being, how can this be? Well, let me ask you again in the audience, how many of you have gone through a redesign that actually performed worse than what it was before the redesign? 35% of you. Right? Well, I think we've all been there at some level, right? And so the question is, why does this happen? We go into the design process making all kinds of decisions about how our new site's going to be better, how the user experience is going to be better, the design is going to be so much better, functionality. We're all excited about it, and it launches and has the potential to flop. Sometimes it goes up, sometimes it goes down. When we look at why this happens, largely revolves around how we make decisions during that process. The decisions that we make during the design and development process of this new site largely determine our success rate. So I'm going to ask you a bunch of techniques that are data-driven tools that can be used in the design and development process. I want to understand from those of you in the audience, how many of you have used each of these as I go through them. So during the design process, you could do user surveys, ask your customers for information, and use that information to actually impact your design process. How many of you have done user surveys in your design process? Right, it's about 15% of you. How many of you have user testing as part of the redesign process? A little bit more, 20%, good. Prototyping. Only a few. How many have done A/B or conversion testing as part of the redesign? About 25%. How many have used web analytics data to actually drive your design process? Good, almost 35%. How many have done a beta or a soft launch before launching the redesign? How many have used heat mapping in the design process? Only a handful. How many have done all of the above? Congratulations. So the question now is, these are all tools that can help and aid the design process. So the question is, should we be doing these things? I guess I'll ask you. Anyone think that we should not be doing these things? I was hoping for one hand at least. So if we should be doing these things, why aren't we, right? So what are the reasons why we don't do user testing as part of the design process? And in the work that we've done and the conversations that I've had with people, typical answers are budget, right? This takes more time and effort to do. Timeline, these things take time to do. So if I have to launch my site in 3 months, you're not going to have a big window of time to actually perform these additional steps. Lack of familiarity. People aren't used to these tools. They don't know them. Your designers or the people making these decisions don't have a history of using these tools before, and their lack of familiarity, they don't know what they don't know. These are a combination of reasons why people typically aren't taking these steps. But they're shortcutting the process and exposing themselves to a great deal of risk when you don't actually perform these steps. So what I wanted to do today is show you some examples of things that we would typically encourage you to do in your design and development processes to actually increase the odds of success. But redesigns aren't the only focus here, right? So we spend a lot of money and a lot of resources on replatforming or redesigning a site. We launch it, and that's a big part of the process. But after that happens, we all make changes to our website every day. maybe every week, maybe every other week. We make changes to our website all the time. Very few of you here actually leave your website without any changes to them over several months or a year. And when we look at that process, we're exposing ourselves to the same problems. But we don't take these steps to actually improve the odds that the changes we're making to the website are changes that are actually going to move needles. So let's talk about ongoing enhancements and roadmaps. Again, roadmap planning, I'm sure most of you have a roadmap for the year, for the quarter, or at least a list of ideas of things that you want to add or enhance your website with over the year. And when I work with clients and I look at their roadmaps, and I ask them line by line, item by item, why is this on your roadmap and why is this on your roadmap? And it's not to question them, but to really understand what is the reasoning behind this item ending up on this list. And like I mentioned before, oftentimes it's something I learned at a conference, or I think this might work, or my buddy did it over there and it worked really well for their company, or my boss really wants this feature. And the key for me is this roadmap is critical to making sure that we're making data-driven decisions. Because if we don't start by putting the right items on the list, we're already a step behind. The second piece of roadmaps that are really important is if you measure the impact of those items on those roadmaps. So again, most of you, I assume, have roadmaps or lists of things that you're going to do throughout the year. When those features are designed, developed, and implemented, how many of you here actually measure the impact of a single feature deployment on your website as you go along, by a show of hands? Great. So you got about 15, 20% of you. Good. This is really important. I mean, I think it's kind of crazy that not just the e-com industry, but web as a whole, people make changes to websites every single day without really measuring the impact of those changes. And what's ironic about it is that is the one huge advantage we have in digital. The one giant advantage we have is data, being able to measure things and test things and understand the impact of the things that we do. In the print world, they don't have that luxury. And the fact that we don't take advantage of that is pretty astounding. And I think we'll all look back as an industry 5 years from now and kind of laugh at ourselves because we didn't take advantage of these golden opportunities. So I encourage each item in your roadmap to understand why you're doing it, what is your goal with that feature, and how you're going to measure the success of that deployment, and what KPIs are you specifically looking to move. And as you develop those features and as you go through that process, to make sure that you have a measurement tool in place. This could be analytics, as in terms of your web analytics, looking at in before and after, although I'm not a huge fan of before and after measurement. There's seasonal trending, there's annual fluctuations, there's all kinds of variables at play that if you look at year over year or period over period, it's not a very accurate representation of the impact of that change because there's many other variables at play. If you do measure before and after, I'd encourage you to use a forecasting model. So essentially, if I deployed a new feature to my site and I wanted to measure the impact of it strictly using analytics, that I can look at a period, let's say 2 weeks or a month or whatever that time frame is, and use a forecasting model to actually look at what the sales would have been during that period of time if you didn't change a thing, and compare against the forecasted model of revenue that would have happened during that period of time instead of doing period over period or year over year comparisons. But ultimately, A/B testing is the best tool to most accurately understand the impact of those changes. And by isolating those changes and measuring them side by side, you can also get a really clear picture of the impact of those changes. So if anything, measure it one way or the other. But I want to talk a little about data-driven decisions in action. I'll show you some examples of things, again, that using some of these tools and techniques of how you can use them in your everyday and decision-making process. So everyone's big into data nowadays. The big data fad has caught fire several years ago, and everyone's talking about data, 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 data. It's great. I love the fact that there's momentum behind making data-driven decisions, because it probably was one of the most underutilized marketing tools in our space. But data on its own is worthless, right? So a lot of us have data. We have analytics data. We have sales data, history of customers, and it just sits there. We don't really actively use it. You log into web analytics, you look at the number of visits you had or your conversion rate, but are you really doing anything about it, using that data to drive actual insight? So really the key here is not just data alone. The key is how you use the data and how you leverage the data. And that ultimately is priceless. Leveraging this data and harnessing it, just as a frame of reference, look at Amazon's success. I mean, Amazon wasn't successful by chance. Amazon was successful because they pioneered the use of data before any of us. And they beat us all to the punch. And they're light years ahead of us. Data has made Amazon what it is today. And the fact that we largely neglect it is, I think, a sign of why Amazon's doing so well. So what we want to do is incorporate quantitative and qualitative data into the decision-making process. And so quantitative data, obviously things that you can measure numerically, and qualitative data meaning things that you can observe. So I can show you some examples. User research as a form of qualitative, there's a typo on this one. So ask your customers, right? Ask your customers, how can I make this experience better? There are different ways to do this. So one example, card sorting. A lot of us go through a card sorting exercise in our design processes already when we design the navigation or the hierarchy of our site. How many of you have done a card sorting exercise? How many of you had actually had your customers do the card sorting exercise? Only a handful. Right, so we all look at our website and our nomenclature and how we organize data from a very slanted view. We are in deep with our products, but knowing how your customers look for your products is really the key. So what I would encourage you to do is to actually have your customers, or your customers, do the card sorting exercises for you. And so we did this with a client of ours actually fairly recently. They sell a home decor, and this was all the categories, right? So we took all their categories, we grabbed a couple of their customers and pulled them aside and asked them for 5 minutes of their time. And in 5 minutes of their time, we gave them index cards with each one of these on them, and we asked them to group them how they feel they should be organized. And we did this with several clients, or several customers of theirs, and not everyone's going to be exactly the same. Every customer might view it a little differently, but what you find is patterns. Patterns of how people browse for things and how people would expect, intuitively to them, where something should logically be located. And through this exercise, you come up with a navigation scheme that's not designed for you, but it's designed for your customers. We found this to be a very effective technique to actually doing it, and it doesn't take really much time at all. It's such a simple technique that takes literally minutes of time. Incredibly valuable. You can also use other forms of qualitative data like user feedback tools. So an example, Quality, right? So you can find out what your customers are looking for. Did you find what you're looking for? Ask your customers. These tools can pop up on the website. You can control the timing of them. But really gather more data and more intelligence to understand what was working well currently and what maybe some of the challenges are. Find out why customers leave your site. You can have the mouse tracking so that if they quickly browse up to close the tab in a window, a little pop-up message could pop up and again, gather some more intelligence and data. This type of data should be used to drive your roadmap, right? The feedback from your customers and the surveys that you do for them really should be telling you what you need to be working on instead of what you learn at a conference, except for this session, of course. User testing. So this is an example of a client, Scout Bags, that this is their site before the redesign. And we went through the redesign process, and we did some user testing with their customers. We actually brought several of their customers into our office, sat them in front of a computer, had them do very specific tasks, recorded we asked them to express verbally what their thoughts were, and went through this process. And one of the things that really surprised us with Scout that we didn't anticipate, that we would not have designed for if not for user testing, we knew that the patterns and the colors of these products were really important. It's a fun product. People love browsing and shopping for these things. It's a playful product. colors and patterns we knew were pretty important to this process. What we did not know was that the product names were actually a really important piece of the shopping process. They have really creative product names. They're actually rather funny. So when we learned this data by doing user testing before the redesign off of their current site. Through that, we wanted to put a little bit more emphasis on the new site on the product names. Now, we didn't want to put it in people's faces and overemphasize it. There's a delicate balance you want to draw. So we created the new site with a little bit more focus around the names. And I'm going to play for you a quick video that we used after we went through the design process. Right before we launched it, we used usertesting.com and actually got a bunch of customers to browse the site, and again, recorded those experiences as part of the redesign process. I want to share with you a quick little video snippet. I got to do a quick little switch over here. Hopefully we get the audio. This is pretty funny.
So Mary Tyler Moorish, very cute. Very cute names. I like the quirkiness.
And I really love the name on this Kelly Green pickler. It's so cute.
The stiff one. The names of these are really funny.
So I would say Lucia Platy.
Big Band Theory. I love it. American Bandstand. Oh my god. Sweet Tea. These are fantastic names. Pedal Pusher. Mint Tea. Cold Shelter. These are... Ship Happens. Oh my gosh. These are like the best names ever.
Right, so through user testing, we found this opportunity that we otherwise did not know exist. And so during the design process, we had a hypothesis that the product names were an important part of the shopping process. We wanted to make sure that they were always visible to the customers as they were browsing. And the user testing we did at the end of the design process validated that hypothesis. So we use user testing before and after. You can do it using online tools. You can do it bringing people into the office. What was really funny about this particular case, they actually gained about 5 customers that actually ordered products from the user testing that they were doing because they actually liked the products and wanted to buy some. Other forms of qualitative data, heat mapping tools, right? So you can use heat mapping tools in your existing website. If you're not familiar with a heat mapping tool, essentially what it does is it tracks mouse movements and where people tend to focus. And it's predicated on a notion that if you do eye tracking studies, you bring people into a lab, you put a monitor and track their eye movements, and when they see a page, they focus on specific things very first in a very particular order. What they found was that people's mouse movements tended to reflect those eye movements. People move their mouse based on things they're looking for. So there are JavaScript-based heat mapping tools that track people's attention and where it's focused. There's another actually type of tool that has looked at thousands of different heat maps and eye tracking studies and created an algorithm that can algorithmically predict what an eye tracking study outcome might look like. I wouldn't say it's 100% accurate, but it's close enough for us. But we use this in our design process because ultimately we want people's attention focused on very particular areas on our pages. So if you had a product page, for example, you would probably want people's attention first and foremost focused on maybe the hero shot and maybe the add to cart button or area, the confidence builders. Right, so where people's attention are focused is based on a lot of variables. Right? The contrast, the colors, the spacing, lots of different variables in the design process. And when we created this landing page for the Franklin Mint, we went through several iterations internally. And we used this predictive heat mapping tool. We run our design mock-ups through that. And what we can do from these steps is actually make revisions to our design as we're designing it before even a client sees it. And in this particular case, our goal on this page was to get people to click the play video, or to click the play button on the video. And what we saw is that big button in the center of the screen really didn't get a lot of focus on the page. And so we made some subtle adjustments to the page and actually improved this quite a bit, where people's attention was focused on that button. And there was only actually a couple of subtle little changes. I'll try to switch back and forth here. I don't know if the back button will work in this thing. There we go. So a couple subtle changes. One, we changed that turquoise button to white. And the Founding Fathers of America in the top right corner, we changed the text from red to gold all the way around. A couple other subtle little changes, but very subtle changes had a pretty dramatic impact on this heat map. And so from this, the end result was this page that we actually performed A/B split testing on as well when we launched it to actually validate that this variation did work better than other variations that we had come up with during the design process. So predictive heat mapping tools can really give us some insight about where people's attention is most likely going to be focused. If we want it focused on particular actions and areas, we want to make sure we incorporate that into the design process. Quantitative data. I would imagine you all have a web analytics platform. How many of you actually have used analytics data in the design process again? I think there's about 25% of you. Right. There's great intelligence when you redesign a site to understand about your current site and what works well and what doesn't. Chances are you might have some things that work very well despite how poorly your designer might think it might be designed. And in this particular case, when we were going through redesign for spec products, we're doing the whole thing responsive, we looked at their homepage, and in particular a couple elements on that homepage, focusing on this top area of this slider. A lot of you probably have big hero images that rotate through. What we found through analytics was that the homepage slider, despite taking up 50% of the real estate, only accounted for 7% of the click-throughs on the homepage. We also saw that the revenue per visitor of the resulting pages that people landed on were very low in comparison to other pages on the site. We were actually leading people to pages that did not perform as well. And I think most surprising was that over half of the people that clicked through to one of those pages, their next page they visited was right back to the home page to find where they probably wanted to go in the first place. So when we redesigned the site, we use this data as part of the process to understand how do we make this homepage, how do we make these homepage sliders better? Part of it's the content, could be the design or the implementation of how it was done. But these are all important elements that we learned through looking at the web analytics data to actually understand how people were interacting with that page and how we can improve that page. In addition to that, it's really important to, during the design process, actually identify what additional tags you want to be putting on your website. So, like I mentioned before, we're a Google Analytics partner, and one of the very fundamental requirements to being a Google Analytics partner was that Google wants to make sure that everyone has a robust analytics implementation. Let me ask you, how many of you here use Google Analytics? Probably most of you. How many of you use only the standard JavaScript that comes with it? So most of you have done custom tagging. Let me ask that. How many of you have done custom tagging, event tracking, etc. on your site with Google Analytics? Good. So it's important to do in the design process as part of your understanding of the goals of the site and what metrics you might want to measure. When we go through the wireframing process, we actually identify specific actions and buttons and events that we want to track using analytics. So this is part of our requirements documentation, essentially. We have a UX designer or architect that does the wireframing. We actually have a data analyst that comes in, identifies areas of the site that we want to track, specific actions, events, etc. And these are kind of, if you don't understand JavaScript, you might not understand what the heck this means, but we're essentially calling out different buttons and saying this is the specific JavaScript event tracking we want to have attached to that button click or a certain action. And we can now track that in analytics and use that for further decision making. And you have better data to work with and a more robust analytics implementation than just the standard JavaScript couple lines. Also with quantitative data, A/B testing. How many of you here have done any amount of A/B testing ever? Good, almost half of you. A little more than half. A/B testing ultimately is going to be the most accurate way for us to measure the effectiveness of our decisions. Whether things worked worse, whether things worked better. At the end of the day, the most important aspect of A/B testing is what you learn from those tests. You might learn that certain things you didn't work out so well, or didn't do what you expected. You had a certain decision or a hypothesis that you made. I think our user experience is going to be better if I change this product page like so. And most of the time, people make those changes and they roll them out, and then they kind of move on to the next set of changes. But testing is a technique for you to learn a great deal about your customers. So I'll give you a couple examples. How many of you here have an email newsletter sign up on your site? How many of you have tested the length of time before that pop-up shows up? Only a handful. It's a very easy test to do. You can test the messaging, you can test the look and feel of it, etc. So with one of our clients, WMF, we had this pop-up, and we tested different timings of when it would appear. 1 second, 5 second, 15, 30, you name it. We tested several different delays. I actually found out that at 5 seconds, that pop-up performed optimally. It had a 3.9% sign-up rate at 5 seconds. This was more than double of any other time that we tested against. So if you have this on your site and you haven't tested the timing, you could be dramatically missing out on a lot of newsletter sign-ups simply because you haven't gotten the timing just right for your customers. So really encourage you to use testing to test how you implement things and different ways it can be implemented. How many of you, I asked this earlier, there's a bunch of you that said you've been through a redesign process where the new site actually performed worse. Again, the data behind the study indicates that as well. And when you're redesigning a site, you take a lot of risk, right? Even if you take these steps, there is still inherent risk of changing your entire user experience and rolling it out to your customers. So a great way to mitigate that risk and use data to actually help you make better decisions is to test a complete site redesign before it launches. So this particular client, they had worked with a different SI, and they had designed a site and developed it, and they came to us kind of late in the game, and they said, listen, we got a lot of risk on the line here, and we don't want to potentially damage our business by launching a site that could perform worse. What do we need to do to mitigate that risk? So of course we say, well, let's test the new site against the current one. So we directed 5% of their traffic from the current site to the new one. And over time, the goal would be to increase that to 10%, to 20%, and keep adding more and more to make sure we have confidence that the new site is performing better. In this particular case, they saw that the new site was performing 20% worse. And if they had simply launched the site without testing it, they would be scrambling. I've seen it happen many times. There's always a mad scramble after a site launches. Why is revenue down? What happened? There must be bugs. What's going on? This is a great way to actually help prevent that from ever happening, to ensure that the new site is actually going to perform better. I was actually having a conversation with someone earlier today in the exhibit hall, and very confident that the new site was going to perform better, and that's great. I would encourage you to still test it to make sure. And so now what we can do in this scenario is identify why there's this 20% breakdown, perform more testing on the new site, while the current site is still generating the revenue. And eventually, through a series of tests, we'll be able to get this negative 20% up to a positive number, and that builds the confidence that, hey, we're now ready to launch this site because it's going to perform better than the current one. So how do we get from where we are today in our decision-making process to where we should be in the future? So a couple of pointers. Again, most of us create roadmaps. Make sure you understand why items are on that roadmap and how to measure the items on that roadmap. If you change it, measure it. Every change to your site, find a way to measure it with analytics or testing or something. And most importantly, learn from the results. I think people get down on themselves when they make changes to a website and it actually performs worse because I think they're failing. Actually, those are great learning experiences, and through time, you'll learn a lot about what works and what doesn't work with your customers, and you're going to have to fail a few times in order for that to happen. So don't be discouraged by results that are negative. They should be embraced, and they should be analyzed and understood. You got to invest in data. As I mentioned, some of the roadblocks to people not using data today, it takes time, it takes money, it takes resources, and you have to invest in it. And it has to be a commitment to investing in data so that you know your short-term costs are going to increase by leveraging data. Your results, both short-term and long-term, should also increase, but it needs an initial investment. Risk-taking, again, there's always a risk. No matter what you do, there's always going to be a risk. And with risk comes reward, and with risk comes failure. Right? So with Scout Bags, when we redesigned that site, we took a lot of risks. We took a very different approach to the overall shopping experience, which resulted in an 80% lift in revenue per visitor. But without those risks, if we just played it safe, we would not be able to see those kind of rewards. So you have to take some risks. We want to mitigate the impact of the negatives of that risk and use data to help mitigate some of that and to make sure that you're going to increase the probability for success. You have to create a culture around being data-driven, and it needs to start at the top. In our office in Charleston, I think I'm most famous for walking around the office asking developers and designers, that looks great, how are we going to measure that? And I say it all the time. I have some employees here that can probably attest to this. It has to start at the top, and you have to have a culture around valuing data and using it in not just your website, but in a lot of decisions you make. Setting up team and department goals around measurement and analytics and data goes a long way in encouraging and building a culture of using data to drive decisions. You need to have commitment and repetition. And I see a lot of people try to start using data, and they'll use it for a month or 2 or 3, and it's very short-lived. They oftentimes fall back into old habits, what's comfortable for them. There's a challenge to change, and you have to make sure you're challenging yourself to constantly evolve and to using data more effectively. And you got to have the right people on the bus. Some people just aren't going to get it, don't want to do it, particular designers. Any designers in here? They're probably all at the responsive design session. That's where they belong. A lot of web designers are really focused on making things look pretty. A lot of brand people are really focused on the brand and the intangibles that are hard to measure. When you think about how web design has kind of evolved into UX design and really focusing on the overall user experience and how do we make that better, really good UX designers want this data because they want different inputs to help them understand how to make the user experience better because that's their ultimate goal. But you got to have the right people on the bus, and some people are just going to fight tooth and nail, and sometimes not a good fit. Finding a balance is really important. Again, I'm not saying that data should drive every decision you make, but data should be involved in the decision-making process more so than it is in most cases today. So we don't want to eliminate people's judgment or experience or intuition or the brand, right? The brand is really important. We want to make sure that we balance out the needs of both and to make sure that, see, we already get a pre-round of applause. Just making sure I got enough time here. All right. And ultimately, results, right? Taking these steps has proven in our business to have a greater degree of success for our clients. And a greater degree of success is a higher probability. Again, I can't guarantee anything, but I can tell you that the steps that we take are going to increase the probability of success. And ultimately, that's what we're here to do. By being smarter about what we're doing and using data, we're going to increase our odds of success. And that's ultimately what we're trying to achieve.